The stage lights were too bright for his eyes. The microphone stand was taller than his body, and the audience, 200 strangers, might as well not have existed at all. In August 1962, a 4-year-old boy stood frozen on a stage in Gary, Indiana, unable to see who he was supposed to sing for. That boy was Michael Jackson. And what happened next would make him cry in front of everyone and quietly change music history forever. The room was small, thick with cigarette smoke and the low hum of adult conversation. It wasn't a grand theater. It wasn't glamorous. It was a modest club in Gary, Indiana, the kind of place where local musicians fought for attention over clinking glasses and tired laughter. But on that night, it became the setting for the very first public performance of Michael Jackson. He was only 4 years old. At that age, most children were learning how to tie their shoes. Michael was being placed under stage lights. Joseph Jackson stood near the edge of the room, arms crossed, eyes sharp. He had spent weeks preparing his sons for this moment. Jackie, Tito, German, and Marlon had rehearsed endlessly. Their harmonies were tight, their choreography simple but disciplined. This wasn't just a family hobby. Joseph saw something bigger, something serious. And then there was Michael. The youngest, the smallest, barely 3 feet tall, his shoes were polished, his suit was carefully pressed, his hair was neatly combed. To the audience he looked adorable, to Joseph he looked like potential. The music began. The older brothers stepped into formation with confidence they had learned through repetition and fear. The microphone stand stood tall at center stage, adjusted for adults, not children. Michael walked forward, exactly where Joseph had told him to stand. And then it happened. The microphone blocked his view. The stage lights hit his face, white and blinding. From where Michael stood, the audience disappeared into darkness. He couldn't see the people. He couldn't see the room. Worse, he couldn't see his brothers clearly anymore. The noise blurred together. The heat from the lights pressed down on him. For the first time in his short life, Michael Jackson felt truly alone. He opened his mouth to sing and froze. His hands clenched at his sides. His eyes darted, searching for something familiar. His heart began to race. He had rehearsed the song hundreds of times at home. He knew every word. But now, standing there, unable to see, unable to orient himself, the confidence drained out of him. From the audience, a few confused murmurs rose. The band hesitated. Joseph saw it instantly. Without warning, Joseph Jackson walked onto the stage. In the middle of the performance, the room fell silent. The brothers stiffened. They knew that look. They had seen it at home. This was not part of the plan. Joseph reached the microphone stand, grabbed it firmly, and yanked it upward, tilting it away from Michael's face so the audience could finally see him. But that wasn't all. He leaned down toward his 4-year-old son, his face hard, his voice low but sharp. Whatever he said wasn't meant for the audience, but Michael heard it clearly. And then Joseph stepped back. To the crowd, it looked like a father correcting a technical issue. To Michael, it felt like the ground disappearing beneath his feet. His eyes welled up instantly. The tears came fast and uncontrollable. His lips trembled. His chest tightened. 4 years old, 200 people watching, bright lights, no escape. Michael Jackson began to cry on stage. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Some people smiled sympathetically, others looked away. A few whispered, this wasn't entertainment anymore, it was raw, real. And that's when something extraordinary happened. Before Joseph could react, before the band could stop, Michael's brothers moved. Jackie stepped closer, placing a steady hand on Michael's shoulder. Tito leaned in, blocking some of the light with his body. German knelt slightly, bringing his face down to Michael's level, whispering words only Michael could hear. "You're okay, we're here, sing with us." Marlon wrapped an arm around him. The formation changed, not choreographed, not rehearsed, but instinctive. 4 boys protecting the smallest one among them. The audience watched as the brothers closed ranks around Michael Jackson. The music resumed. Michael's tears didn't stop immediately. His voice cracked when he finally sang his first line. But something shifted. Surrounded by his brothers, shielded from the lights, anchored by familiar voices, Michael found his footing again. He sang. Soft at first, fragile, then stronger. The room changed. People leaned forward. The noise faded. Conversation stopped. There was something about that voice, small but piercing, emotional in a way that didn't make sense coming from someone so young. By the end of the song, the audience was applauding. Michael was still wiping tears from his cheeks when the applause hit him like a wave. He didn't fully understand what had just happened. He only knew that he had been scared, humiliated, and comforted, all within a few minutes. But something inside him locked into place that night. That stage wasn't just a place of fear anymore. It was a place of survival. Years later, Michael Jackson would talk about being terrified of the stage as a child, how the pressure, the expectations, and the discipline carved deep emotional grooves into him. That night in Gary wasn't an isolated moment. It was the beginning of a pattern. The stage would always demand something from him, and Michael would always give it everything. What few people realize is that this moment shaped the way Michael performed for the rest of his life. His need for control, his obsession with sightlines, lighting, stage design, his insistence on knowing exactly where every spotlight would hit, where every camera would be placed. He never wanted to feel that small again. As the years passed, Michael grew, but the memory stayed. By the time he was 5, then 6, then 10, he commanded the stage like it belonged to him. He learned how to use the lights instead of being blinded by them. He learned how to project beyond the microphone stand. He learned how to turn vulnerability into power. But deep inside, there was always that 4-year-old boy crying under hot lights, unable to see the audience. And maybe that's why audiences around the world felt such an intense connection to Michael Jackson. They weren't just watching perfection. They were watching someone who had learned to turn fear into magic. That first performance didn't end in triumph the way history books like to frame it. It ended with a child in tears, clinging to his brothers. But that was the moment the Jackson brothers stopped being just a group of kids singing together. They became a unit. They became protectors. And Michael became something else entirely. He became a performer who understood, before he could even read, that the stage was both dangerous and powerful. That pain could be transformed. That emotion could move people. That night in August 1962 didn't make Michael Jackson famous. It made him aware. Aware of the cost, aware of the spotlight, aware that music could expose you or save you. Decades later, when Michael Jackson stood on massive stages in front of tens of thousands of people, perfectly lit, perfectly framed, perfectly in control, few in the crowd knew that his relationship with the stage began with tears. But that's the truth. Before the moonwalk, before the gloves, before the legend, there was a 4-year-old boy who couldn't see the audience and cried. And that moment, as painful as it was, planted the seed for everything that came after. The applause that followed that first song did not sound like victory to Michael. It sounded distant, hollow, almost unreal, like thunder heard from underwater. His brothers guided him off the stage, their hands firm and reassuring, their faces unreadable. Joseph didn't say much as they stepped down. He didn't need to. His silence carried weight. That night back in the cramped family home in Gary, Indiana, Michael lay awake long after his brothers fell asleep. The house creaked with every passing truck outside. The smell of hair oil and laundry soap lingered in the air. His eyes stared into the darkness as the moment replayed again and again in his mind. The blinding lights, the towering microphone, his father's shadow falling over him, the sting of tears he couldn't stop. He didn't yet have the language to describe what he felt, But it was something between fear and determination, between shame and a strange pull that drew him back toward the stage, even as it frightened him. That was the paradox that would define Michael Jackson for the rest of his life. The next morning, Joseph woke the boys early. Practice resumed as if nothing unusual had happened. No comfort, no discussion, no acknowledgement of tears. In the Jackson household, emotions were obstacles. Discipline was survival. Michael stood at the edge of the room as his brothers rehearsed. He watched closely, absorbing everything. He noticed how Jackie held himself, how Tito's fingers moved with confidence over the strings, how German projected his voice outward, as if daring the room to listen. Michael said nothing, but something inside him shifted. He began to sing louder during rehearsals, not because Joseph asked him to, but because he didn't want to disappear again. He learned how to tilt his head upward so the lights wouldn't blind him as much. He learned how to find his brothers' voices even when he couldn't see them clearly. Most of all, he learned that if the stage was going to expose him, then he would expose himself first, on his own terms. Weeks turned into months. The Jackson brothers began performing more regularly at local clubs, talent shows, and community events. Each time, Michael grew a little more confident, still small, still the youngest, but now when he stepped toward the microphone, there was a flicker of something new in his eyes. Focus. Audiences began to notice it too. They would come for the novelty of children performing like adults, but they stayed because of Michael. There was something unexplainable in the way he sang. He didn't just hit notes, he felt them. Even as a child, his voice carried emotion far beyond his years. People whispered about him after shows. "That little one, did you hear him?" Joseph heard those whispers too. And with them came higher expectations. By the time Michael was 6, the pressure intensified. Rehearsals became longer, mistakes were less tolerated. Joseph demanded perfection not just from Michael but from all his sons. But Michael felt it more acutely. He was the one people came to see now, the one they pointed at, the one whose voice made rooms go quiet. The stage no longer blocked his view, but the weight of attention pressed harder than ever. Yet every time he felt himself falter, his brothers closed in around him, just like they had that first night. On stage, they moved as one. Off stage, they protected him in quieter ways, shielding him from Joseph's sharpest words when they could, distracting him with jokes, reminding him that he wasn't alone. That brotherhood became Michael's anchor. Years later, fans would marvel at how Michael Jackson seemed both impossibly confident and deeply fragile at the same time. What they were seeing wasn't contradiction, it was continuity. The same child who cried under stage lights learned to command them, but never forgot how easily they could burn. By 1965, the Jackson 5 were winning talent competitions across the Midwest. Their name began to circulate beyond Gary. Promoters called, opportunities grew, and with each new stage, Michael remembered that first night, the fear, the tears, the sudden realization that music could hurt. But he also remembered the applause. He remembered how singing again, despite the fear, made the room change. That lesson stayed with him. When the Jackson 5 finally signed with Motown in the late 1960s, Michael was still a child, but his understanding of performance was already advanced. He paid attention to everything: sound balance, microphone height, lighting angles. He watched engineers adjust equipment and asked questions no one expected a kid to ask. Why does the echo sound different here? Why does the light feel hotter from this angle? Why does the microphone distort when I sing louder? Those questions weren't curiosity alone. They were survival strategies. Michael never wanted to be caught off guard again. Inside Motown studios surrounded by legends, Michael carried himself with quiet intensity. He listened more than he spoke, and when he sang, everyone noticed the same thing. That voice still carried vulnerability, but now it was controlled, directed, weaponized. He had learned how to turn pain into precision. As the Jackson 5 exploded into international fame, the world saw smiling suits, synchronized moves, infectious melodies. What they didn't see was the child behind the curtain, still negotiating with fear every time the lights came on. That fear never left Michael Jackson. It evolved. It sharpened his instincts. It pushed him to rehearse harder than anyone else. It made him obsess over details others ignored. It fueled his desire to outdo himself again and again. Because deep down, Michael believed something dangerous, that if he ever stopped being extraordinary, the world might turn its back on him, just as the stage once had. And so he ran faster, sang higher, danced harder. Not to impress, to survive. When Michael eventually stepped out on his own as a solo artist, that childhood moment followed him into every performance. From the Motown 25 stage to packed stadiums across the globe, he designed his shows so no child, no performer, would ever feel as exposed as he once did. He controlled the lights. He controlled the sound. He controlled the silence. He learned how to disappear into music so completely that fear couldn't reach him. But the cost was heavy. The same sensitivity that allowed Michael Jackson to connect so deeply with audiences also left him vulnerable. He absorbed criticism like a wound. He felt rejection intensely, and even at the height of his fame, there were moments when he still felt like that 4-year-old boy, too small, overwhelmed, searching for reassurance. That's why his connection with fans was never casual. When Michael sang, he wasn't performing for people. He was performing with them. He needed them. And maybe they sensed that. Because when audiences screamed his name, when they reached out toward him, when they cried during his songs, they weren't just witnessing talent. They were witnessing a shared exchange of emotion. Fear transformed into joy. Vulnerability turned into spectacle. The stage that once made him cry became the place where he felt most understood. And it all traced back to that night in August 1962. A microphone stand, blinding lights, a father stepping forward, a child in tears, brothers forming a shield. That moment didn't break Michael Jackson. It shaped him. It taught him that pain and performance were inseparable, that music could expose wounds, but also heal them. That being seen was terrifying, but being unheard was worse. And so he chose to be seen. Again and again, the years that followed did not soften Michael Jackson, they sharpened him. As the Jackson family's world expanded beyond Gary, Indiana, the road became their second home. Long drives, cheap motels, dressing rooms that smelled of dust and sweat, stages that varied wildly, from polished theaters to makeshift platforms barely held together by wood and nails. Each one carried its own risks, its own unpredictability. And every time Michael stepped onto one, his body remembered that first stage. The height, the lights, the feeling of being swallowed by space. But he learned to adapt. By the time he was 7, Michael had developed a strange ritual before performances. He would quietly test the floor with his shoes, feeling for weak spots. He would glance up at the lights, blinking deliberately to adjust his eyes. He would hum under his breath, not to warm up his voice, but to ground himself. No one taught him this. It came from instinct. Joseph interpreted Michael's focus as obedience, as discipline, as proof that pressure worked. What he didn't see was the cost. The way Michael withdrew after shows, the way he curled inward when alone, the way his smile faded the moment the applause stopped. At school, Michael barely existed. While other children played outside, he rehearsed. While others learned social rules, he learned stage cues. Fame came early, and with it, isolation. Yet something remarkable happened as the Jackson 5's reputation grew. Michael stopped crying on stage. Not because he stopped feeling fear, but because he learned how to outrun it. Fear became energy. Nervousness became rhythm. Anxiety became precision. The very sensations that once overwhelmed him now fueled his performances. His heart racing before a show wasn't panic anymore, it was ignition. Audiences felt it. They didn't know why this child felt different from other child performers. They couldn't articulate it. But when Michael Jackson sang, there was urgency in his voice, as if something mattered deeply, as if every note carried weight. That urgency came from survival. When the Jackson 5 finally arrived at Motown headquarters in Detroit, Michael was still small, but his presence filled rooms. Executives expected novelty. What they encountered instead was intensity. Barry Gordy watched closely. He noticed how Michael didn't fidget while waiting, how he listened intently when others spoke, how, when asked to sing, he didn't hesitate, not out of confidence but out of necessity. Michael sang as if stopping would be dangerous. Motown reshaped the Jackson 5 into a polished product, matching outfits, media training, carefully scripted interviews, smiles on demand. Michael learned how to answer questions while revealing nothing, how to appear joyful even when exhausted, how to perform happiness as convincingly as he performed music. The stage had taught him that lesson early. Behind the scenes, the pressure multiplied. Fame removed the anonymity Michael never really had to begin with. His mistakes were no longer private. His fear had nowhere to hide. And yet, something unexpected happened. The more people watched him, the more Michael leaned into performance. Because performance was control. When he sang, the rules were clear. The song began, the song ended, applause followed. On stage, he knew what was expected. Off stage, the world felt chaotic and confusing. That's why Michael loved rehearsals. Rehearsals were safe. Rehearsals were repetition. Rehearsals meant no surprises. The same child who once froze because he couldn't see the audience now demanded to know exactly how the audience would see him. Camera angles, lighting cues, stage marks, nothing was left to chance. Even as a child, Michael Jackson was building armor. As the Jackson 5 skyrocketed to fame with hits like I Want You Back and ABC, the world celebrated their joy, their youth, their energy. Michael became the face of the group, the one audiences fixated on. But joy for Michael was not effortless. It was intentional. Every spin, every smile, every high note carried effort, concentration, purpose. He wasn't carefree, he was precise. This distinction mattered. Because when the world later questioned why Michael Jackson seemed different, why he struggled with adulthood, why he clung to control, the answers were already written into his childhood. He grew up learning that vulnerability had consequences, that mistakes were public, that fear could be punished or transformed. And he chose transformation. As Michael entered his teenage years, the gap between who he was on stage and who he was off stage widened. On stage, he was electric, commanding, magnetic. Off stage, he was shy, soft-spoken, guarded. People often misunderstood this as contradiction. It was. It was protection. The stage had once humiliated him. Now it was the one place he felt safe, because there he dictated the rules. As a solo artist, Michael took this instinct to unprecedented levels. He didn't just perform songs. He constructed experiences. He designed moments. He turned concerts into controlled environments where unpredictability was minimized. This obsession wasn't vanity. It was memory. Memory of a microphone stand too tall. Memory of lights too bright. Memory of a child who couldn't see. Even in his most triumphant performances, when audiences screamed so loudly they drowned out the music, Michael remained vigilant, focused, hyper-aware. Because deep down, he knew how quickly the stage could turn. And yet, despite everything, he never walked away. That's the part few understand. Michael Jackson could have chosen silence. He could have retreated. He could have protected himself by staying away from the very thing that caused him pain. But he didn't. He walked toward it, again and again, because somewhere inside him lived that 4-year-old boy who cried, and then sang anyway. That child never left. He grew taller, he grew stronger, he grew famous, but the emotional blueprint remained. And perhaps that's why Michael's music resonated so deeply across cultures and generations. People heard themselves in him. Their fear, their longing, their need to be seen. Michael didn't sing at the world. He sang from something the world recognized. Pain, hope, resilience. When Michael Jackson stepped onto the stage for the final time in his life, the lights still burned hot, the audience still roared, the microphone still waited. But he was no longer too small. He had become the stage itself. As Michael Jackson grew older, the world around him grew louder, but inside him a certain quiet settled in. Not peace, not calm, something deeper, a constant awareness, an understanding that attention could be dangerous, that love could vanish, that applause could turn cold without warning. The child who once cried because he couldn't see the audience eventually learned something unsettling. Seeing the audience wasn't always a blessing. By the early 1970s, the Jackson 5 were no longer just performers. They were a phenomenon. Airports flooded with screaming fans. Hotels barricaded for safety. Interviews scheduled back-to-back until faces blurred together. Michael was still a child, but the world treated him like a symbol. And symbols are not allowed to be human. Every smile was expected, every answer rehearsed, every movement scrutinized. The same lights that once blinded him now followed him everywhere, on stage, off stage, even in moments meant to be private. Michael adapted the only way he knew how. He disappeared into performance. On stage, he was untouchable. His body moved with precision that felt supernatural. His voice carried authority far beyond his age. He learned how to pause just long enough to make an audience hold its breath. He learned how to release tension with a single note. But when the curtain fell, the energy drained out of him like water from a cracked vessel. He would retreat into silence, into imagination, into worlds where he wasn't required to be anything for anyone. People around him mistook this withdrawal for arrogance, or strangeness, or immaturity. In truth, it was exhaustion. Michael Jackson had learned early that emotional exposure had consequences, that showing fear invited control, that vulnerability could be used against you. So he guarded his inner world fiercely. And yet, paradoxically, he continued to pour his emotions into music. This contradiction defined him. He trusted sound more than people. Music never shouted at him. Music never demanded explanations. Music didn't punish him for feeling too much. Music listened. As he transitioned from child star to teenage performer, Michael faced a new kind of fear, one he had never rehearsed for. His voice began to change. The very instrument that made him special felt unstable. For a boy whose identity was built around performance, this was terrifying. He practiced relentlessly. He pushed his voice to its limits, afraid that if it failed him, the world would turn away. The same fear that had gripped him at 4 years old returned, different shape, same root. What if they can't hear me anymore? What if I disappear? But Michael didn't disappear. He evolved. As he grew into his solo career, he took complete creative control, not out of ego but out of necessity. Control meant safety. Control meant predictability. Control meant never again being blindsided by a stage that felt too big. He choreographed every movement. He refined every breath. He obsessed over sound textures, layering emotion until it felt tangible. This wasn't perfectionism for praise. It was survival for peace. When Michael Jackson created albums like Off the Wall and Thriller, the world heard innovation. Dance floors exploded. Records shattered, history was rewritten. But beneath the celebration lived the same emotional engine that had driven him since childhood. The need to be understood. The need to connect without being touched. The need to transform fear into something beautiful. Michael didn't just want people to listen to his music. He wanted them to feel what he felt, without ever needing to explain it. That's why his songs carried such emotional clarity. Even joyful tracks carried an undercurrent of longing. Even upbeat rhythms hinted at vulnerability. Because Michael knew something most performers never learn. Joy is not the absence of pain. Joy is what survives it. As the years passed, the world became less kind. Fame hardened into scrutiny. Admiration twisted into suspicion. The same sensitivity that once made Michael extraordinary now made him a target. Critics dissected his appearance, his behavior, his choices. They speculated endlessly, often cruelly, about a man they did not understand. But through it all, Michael continued to perform. Because performance was where he had learned to exist. The stage that once made him cry had become the only place where he felt fully alive. Yet the cost accumulated. The child who learned to endure fear never learned how to rest from it. Michael's sleep was fractured, his trust limited, his circle small. He carried decades of unprocessed emotion inside him, pressure layered upon pressure, memory stacked upon memory. And still, when the music started, he transformed. This transformation wasn't illusion. It was release. Every spin, every glide, every note was a moment where the weight lifted, just enough to breathe. That's why audiences around the world cried when they watched him perform. Not because they were seeing perfection, but because they were seeing someone give everything they had. Michael Jackson didn't hide his soul in his music. He exposed it. And that vulnerability, born on a small stage in Gary, Indiana, never left his art. When people ask why Michael mattered, why his influence endures beyond trends, beyond generations, the answer isn't technical. It's emotional. He understood fear intimately. He understood pressure. He understood what it meant to stand alone under lights that felt too bright. And instead of turning away, he turned that experience into sound, into movement, into connection. That 4-year-old boy who cried because he couldn't see the audience never imagined stadiums chanting his name. He never imagined his voice echoing across continents. He never imagined changing music forever. He only knew one thing. He didn't want to disappear. And he didn't. If this continuation helped you see Michael Jackson not just as a legend, but as a human being shaped by moments of fear and courage, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with others who believe that the most powerful art is born from the most vulnerable beginnings. Because sometimes the smallest voices, when they refuse to be silenced, end up changing the world.